Thank you for joining me. I am DJ and I have Kurt Havens here today. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. Thanks for having me. Um, so I've always been kind of in the science and health realm. So I was pre-med when I was younger, and I left that industry and I went to do other things for a while. And then I came back to this during COVID. I am pursuing a PhD in endocrinology with a focus on androgens. So it kind of winds me up in the bodybuilding realm, I guess. I'm a coach as well, but it kind of helps use it kind of helps in this industry, I think, to have more of a knowledge of this stuff, right, than a lot of the other coaches. I think
Definitely
that's how I
puts you
ended up,
ahead of the
meeting
curve.
you and guys like Todd and Paul and whatnot.
So today, I really wanted to talk to you, pick your brain a little bit on estrogen management for males that are using androgenic anabolic steroids. This is a weird topic for me because I get so many messages from male users asking about erectile dysfunction. And I'd say 99% of the time it comes down to estrogen management, either in one direction or the other. Um, I I get a lot of these messages, and I know you said that's not something that you typically receive.
No, it's so, and you and I have talked about this previously off camera. I think it's really interesting because the two people I know that get the most questions about this stuff are both female coaches. So I think it's interesting that men in a dire situation like that reach out to a woman about this. First of all, not that a man necessarily would have all the answers just by owning the equipment, but I just think it's interesting that
I
this is
owning the
something
equipment.
like I don't think I get DMs all day like you, and I don't think I ever get any questions about guys stuff not working in that way. But I think, like you said, the common theme I see here now is that estrogen seems to be running rampant. All these guys are letting their estrogen fly really high, and it's causing all sorts of problems. Um,
And
I'm not
previous
sure
to this, it was crushing your E2 levels. Estrogen was
the enemy.
demonized in general. And when you hear estrogen, that's not something that you typically affiliate with males.
No.
Now I think that we've had enough data come to light within our industry explaining the importance of it and the neuroprotective properties, especially with some of the compounds we're seeing deployed, especially in competitors. But it's taken a drastic turn. Now we're no longer reducing it to nothing and having those health issues. We are letting it just skyrocket. And some of
Yeah.
the numbers that we both have seen on paper are problematic.
Yeah. And I think, like you said, so bodybuilding is an extreme sport, if you could even call it a sport. And I think part of the issue is that we don't do anything moderate, right? We push everything as far as we can. And estrogen is one of those things. So wherever this trend came from, right, we came out of the 90s where guys like Ronnie Coleman from that generation were crushing estrogen, right? Running multiple AIs. And then we came into this place where we realized medically that estrogen was really healthy to a degree in the right place. And so we were letting it go higher for health reasons, but then it gets mismanaged, I think, in bodybuilders. So then the message is skewed. I agree with the use of like testosterone solo in a small dose for someone new that's on TRT, right? You shouldn't really need an AI for 150 milligrams of
Mhm.
testosterone as a man. Um, and I agree that there's a reason for that. And I agree that you should run. I think Derek from More Plates, More Dates probably started some of this stuff on social media as well. I agree with you leverage test as high as you can go without an AI. And then you add something on top that increases protein expression. And I think that that's a great thing. I think the caveat is that's for newer people. That's for someone who's their first cycle, their second cycle, whatever, until you get to a point where that no longer works. So someone who's been using drugs for a long time or is more advanced is going to use grams of things. And that's not really a valid technique. It's not to say that it can't work in certain individuals. There is a pro bodybuilder. I don't want to name a lot of names, but there's a pro bodybuilder out there who his protocol, he runs like a gram of test and he'll run like a gram of Masteron on top of it to kind of manage estrogen. And that might work perfectly fine for him. I don't know if that's a valid thing for the majority of people. From the blood work that I see, I don't find that it really works, right? And also Masteron works as a SERM. So it's not actually lowering estradiol. It's just blocking it at the receptor.
Mhm.
Primobolan, in theory, acts as an AI, but again, primobolan is not strong enough, in my experience, to really fully crush estrogen in most individuals unless someone's very sensitive or they're using very low amounts of testosterone.
And in theory, it sounds good if you bring in a DHT derivative, especially if it's shown to have some form of anti-estrogenic effect to help you modulate estrogen. But even in all of, again, the blood work that I have seen, while it may be helpful when we're pushing really high levels of testosterone and we do get into more aggressive dosage protocols, I have not been able to leverage those derivatives to where they can be the only thing in place for estrogen management.
Yeah.
Now we might decrease, actual milligrams of what we would typically be using in terms of an aromatase inhibitor, but we're still having to keep
Yeah.
it in place. So I haven't seen it done very well in practice, at least within my own clients. I like the theory behind it, but everyone's going to respond differently. And I know you've been on several podcasts now where you guys have discussed individual effects using either Primo or Mass and how it has impacted your own estrogen levels. And it's wildly different.
It's wild. I think so. Something else I'm seeing more so in international clients too, just on a side note, is the quality or the authenticity of the drugs that they're using. I see a lot of guys that are using what they believe to be primobolan or Mastron or Equipoise, and it turns out these things aren't those drugs at all, and that they're just testosterone. So then a guy thinks he's using 200 milligrams of each, and meanwhile he's using 800 milligrams of testosterone with no AI. That's not always the most common thing, but that's just something to think about is maybe it's worth getting labs done early on and also maybe testing your drugs or at least knowing where you're getting stuff from.
Labs are so important. I always tell, because women always say like, well, I'd rather do Primo than Anavar. Those are really what you hear about the most with women that are using anabolics, but with sourcing being problematic with both of those, unless you're getting prescribed Anavar, essentially you are taking a huge risk with the Primo, because if you get test pro or something like that in place of that, as a female, you're choosing that compound to decrease your risk of virilization. And as a male, if you're utilizing it for the purpose of either estrogen management or just knowing that it doesn't have the ability to aromatize, so it shouldn't impact your estrogen levels, that's a dangerous thing if you don't know what you're putting into your body at that point, because you're using it as a control mechanism.
Totally. And it's failing. And I have numerous guys now that we've had to switch and put them on AIs because we started with that technique, but either what they were sourcing wasn't accurate or it wasn't strong enough to combat, the aromatization. I think, and on a side note too, with the people being anti-estrogen right now with this current trend, which I think is interesting, that people will push things like Masteron, right? The theory is like, well, it'd be much better to run a gram of test than a gram of Masteron, but don't use Arimidex because Arimidex is really horrible. But meanwhile, Masteron's never been tested on men ever in any sort of clinical research. It's never been used in men. So I'm not even sure where that theory would come from. Now, I'm not anti-Masteron either, but I just think it's a funny place to take a stance when we have no data and we have tons of data on Arimidex. And if used responsibly, there's technically nothing wrong with using Arimidex. It's not like that in and of itself is causing all sorts of health problems.
I think some of it comes down to the division that we're seeing within the prescribing clinics for those that are going the pharmaceutical route. I have had clients come to me from non-affiliate clinics basically stating that they were automatically given an AI, maybe at, half milligram 2 times per week on a very low dosage, maybe 140 milligrams of test. And that was automatically prescribed and given to them without a lot of explanation. And then I've had other clients that maybe were given 300 milligrams of test a week and never had follow-up labs to check E2. And then they were told when they asked about it or inquired that it would potentially give them bad side effects and they didn't need it and that they needed estrogen, and they never had those follow-up labs performed. So they were strongly discouraged from any AIs. And these are 2 operating clinics right now. And this is the information that they're providing their patients. So it's a lot of mixed information out there. But what I'm not seeing is that we're not seeing enough information pushing healthy ratios of estrogen in relation to total testosterone.
Yep.
But that requires math. People don't like math.
Totally.
So.
But I think, and that's the problem, right? Medicine is based on averages. All medicine is. It's the only way to come up with these things because you can't do things on an individual case study basis. But I think it's poor medicine for these clinics to blindly make these assumptions and just generally prescribe random amounts to people based on averages, right? Because someone might do really well on 300 milligrams of test and someone might do really poorly. There are people that need an AI and there's other people that don't need an AI. Depends on the amount, depends on the person. It's a genetic thing. There's one gene that controls this. And to me, it's irresponsible. Like as a doctor, I can't imagine it feels responsible just to blindly prescribe things like that one way or the
And I
other.
think a lot of people don't understand that there is actually a genetic component. Now, most people, is that common knowledge that they need to dive into? Probably not. But I think there's a huge misconception that the only factor is going to be body composition and the what we'd be looking at in rates with adipose tissue. But you take someone like my husband, for example, who's very lean at all times, and he aromatizes at the drop of a hat. We
Does he?
have to be very careful with him and all of
Okay.
his protocols. And I think a lot of people think that if they're a healthy body fat composition, then there shouldn't really be a lot of risk and they'll be able to push their testosterone a lot higher without seeing their E2 levels go up as well.
Yeah. And I just think, again, that goes back to labs, right? You said that before. I think the key is that everyone should be getting blood work done, whether you're going to a clinic, whether you're seeing a doctor in person, or whether you're buying stuff off the internet or in the black market. I'm not judging anyone. I just think everyone should be responsible in checking their levels and taking care of stuff. I think so. The gene you mentioned is
Yes.
CYP191A. It's the gene in humans that aromatizes testosterone or androgens into estradiol. It is only one gene, and it's expressed more heavily in body fat than it is in other tissues. But like you said, it's a genetic thing. Everyone has a different amount of this gene. So there's no predicting just by looking at someone, right? I've met guys that had a lot of body fat and they were low aromatizers. I met guys that were lean like your husband that aromatize heavily. I think that there are general categories, like we talked about averages before, but I don't think that that's a safe place to make an assumption without labs. I think if we back up for a second, I think where some of the push to drive estrogen up, not so you have the health side that we talked about in the clinics where it clearly, right, estrogen protects your kidneys and your heart and your lungs and your brain. Estrogen is actually when it crosses the blood-brain barrier, it's actually what's responsible for a man's brain development. So what masculinizes a man's brain is actually estrogen. So it has a huge role, right? And it's protective in a lot of these tissues. But being high doesn't necessarily yield anything better, right? There's a range. And I think then on the bodybuilding side, where it's gone wrong is people take data. There are influencers that see, and you know this, going to school for science, the average person has access to like the abstract of a study. They don't necessarily have access to the entire study. And they also haven't learned how to pull data correctly out of a study, right? That's something you learn over time, is how to read these things and make sense
And
of it.
even with the abstract, sometimes the ability to decipher that information, it becomes very, very skewed. And then you discuss this a lot, I know. Even if you can pull that data and you can interpret it correctly, you have that ability, you have to understand that the demographics that we're talking about, the dosages that we're talking about, drastically different than what's actually being studied, assuming
Yeah.
that the data even crosses over into
Yeah, which
humans.
it generally doesn't, right? I mean, like what, and it's a little bit of a tangent, but to further drive home your point, growth hormone, for instance, most of the studies on humans are done in very ill, terminally ill patients, and they're generally 10 people in the study, 12 people in the study. They're very small groups, and they're not bodybuilders. They're people with HIV. So they don't always, those numbers don't always translate, right? There's only one study in growth hormone done in healthy, young weightlifting people that I know of that was really ever done. But the estrogen thing, where people go wrong with this is they look at the data from Trenbolone and cattle. And what we do at Merck is we drive up the estradiol with the Trenbolone, and most
Mhm.
studies show that that increases growth. There's also studies that show that it didn't have an impact on growth, that they grew just the same from the Trenbolone alone. There's also ones that show they grew with growth hormone and they grew with testosterone. Where people go wrong is because they're just reading this abstract and they don't understand the physiology of a ruminant. So ruminants, cows fit into that group, is that ruminants don't produce something called insulin growth factor binding protein 1. Humans do. That specific binding protein renders IGF, insulin growth factor, useless once out. It's the opposite of estrogen. So when estrogen goes up, it renders IGF useless. Cattle, they don't have this binding protein, so it can, the higher you drive the estrogen, the more they'll grow. In humans, there's a cutoff. And you
Mm-hmm.
can even see it in women. If we did labs right now, you probably have higher growth hormone than I do. I probably have higher IGF than you do, right? So it's disproportionate to your estrogen levels. And so when bodybuilders drive thinking they're going to leverage more growth by letting their estrogen go, I mean, I see guys that are in the hundreds now, 200, 300. They drive it really, really high thinking they're going to get growth. And it looks like, honestly, after 80, there's no more growth. It's just shutting it down. So they're just going to get fat and hold water. And then you and I talked about before, blood pressure issues, right? So then you're adding telmisartan and all these other drugs on top to manage side effects that could be controlled if you just controlled the estrogen to begin with. And it's the same. And again, it goes back to the same flawed thinking. It's the same guy that says, well, Arimidex is bad, Masteron is good, but telmisartan is good. Well, why are those two drugs any better than Arimidex? That's what I see 20-year-old guys that
Where
are
do
on
you
blood pressure.
think the aversion to AIs came into play? Like what point in time did we see this shift? I'd say definitely with over the last year, I've seen this is more, I don't want to say common knowledge because it's not knowledge, but this is the common thought process behind it. But what was the driving force?
Me personally, I feel like there are some online platforms that push. Again, I don't want to insult anyone. I think there's some online teachers per se that kind of push these strategies. I think the initial stuff, honestly, probably came from Derek from More Plates, More Dates. I think he did a bunch of videos with Leo, who's no longer with us, and I think with Figure Steve, and I think they were all talking about this stuff. I just think that the context, it was taken out of context what they were talking about. I don't think Derek was ever saying, don't use an AI. I think he was, if you're watching Derek's video to get steroid advice, you're not an advanced user. Advanced users wouldn't listen to that stuff to take advice. He's talking to a beginner. So if you're a beginner, you probably don't need an AI. But once, like,
And as a beginner, it makes complete sense because that whole foundation of using testosterone only to understand your genetic predispositions,
yep,
your conversion rates. That is how it's handled. You don't just suddenly throw in drugs
correct.
to supposedly mitigate side effects if you don't know if there's even side effects to
Yep,
begin with. So his videos really do apply when you are building that
yes,
foundation before you start experimenting with stacks. It's as you're progressing and
yep,
titrating your testosterone dosages, but I think it's just taken a
yeah,
wild spin in the other direction. Again, because he speaks a lot on the importance of estrogen in terms
yep,
of health, what it does for your body, um, how it allows you to grow more effectively. Like those are all pieces of information he
yep,
touches on. But I know that as from what I've seen, I've only seen maybe a couple instances where he actually starts talking about target ranges.
yep. Well, so
What
that's
do
the thing
you
is we don't
utilize?
know per se, right? We can go. I was just going to say one more thing. I think that Derek, I, and again, I don't think he ever meant anything. I didn't think there was any harmful coming out of. I think he was actually trying to create some sanity in this world because it got to this point where 500 or 600 milligrams of testosterone was looked at as a beginner cycle, right? Or
Mhm.
even worse, you have kids on TikTok that are influenced by people on TikTok that are taking tren for first cycle. And I think he was just trying to bring some sanity to the world and say, listen, man, you don't need half a gram on your first cycle. You can get by with 250 or 300 milligrams and get plenty of growth. And at that dose, you shouldn't really need an AI in theory. And it's not to say it's not to say there aren't people that do, but in theory, you shouldn't. And I think that's where he was going. And then, and he went on further to say things like switching compounds for the sake of switching compounds doesn't really have any benefit. He was onto a lot of really great things that people had not heard before or thought about. I just think it was then taken out of context to this extreme thing when you have a guy on 2 grams a gear who is not going to manage his estrogen. I think that's out of control. With the ratio thing, though, like, we don't actually know what the ideal ratio is when someone's enhanced. We understand it in a natural, but it's actually not. It becomes, I think, more individual. And there's also no way to study it. Like you said, they're not studying, no pharmaceutical company is going to study bodybuilders. They don't care.
Mhm.
So no one's looking at, well, if you give someone 1,000 milligrams of testosterone, how much Arimidex do they need or how much letrozole do they need to manage their estrogen? No one cares. right? You and I care, coaches care, bodybuilders care, but we're not a profitable thing for these companies. So it's not researched at all. So we can just manage it based on symptoms and blood work, but you have to get blood work, and it's not about letting it just go to this extreme place for no reason.
So as a coach, what do you shoot for then in terms of, like, let's say you have a client, they're well into super physiological levels, you're pulling labs. What markers are you utilizing in terms of biofeedback and in terms of actual numbers? What are you looking at for E2?
I would start with biofeedback first. Like I think one of the benefits is you and I can have a relationship with people and we can get firsthand information from them versus just data. Right. So like the first thing I want to know from people is how they feel. Right. Like I know I've had my estrogen very high and I've had it very low. So I know what those things typically feel like. I want to know, someone getting overly emotional. Like there are these classic symptoms when it starts to go high, right? Water retention. Like when you take your socks off, is there a ring around your ankles? Is your blood pressure high? Are you emotional? Erectile stuff, which we can get into in a minute. I think all those things matter almost more than the number to some extent, right? Like obviously, if someone is experiencing some level of gynecomastia, I mean, that's a big deal. That you're now beyond what your body can handle. I would ideally not let it get to that point. Unfortunately, sometimes it just goes there. And then with labs, I think it depends on the androgen load. So if someone is just on TRT and they're young and healthy, I say young for TRT, they're in their 40s, let's say, I would probably strive to keep their estrogen somewhere between 29 and 40. If they're just on TRT, and their testosterone somewhere between, 900 and 1500. I don't think there's any reason to really let it ride much higher than that. The range for most is like 29. So they're already above what the blood work should say is good.
Mm-hmm.
And some individuals feel better and do better with it lower. I do better with mine slightly lower, probably in the 30s, typically. If someone is pushing, if I have a guy that's bigger and he's using 2 grams a test, I would let the estrogen go as high as 80. After that point, I would manage it. And again, I'm not opposed to using AIs. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with them if they're used correctly, right? Like we talked about, it's not necessarily taking a milligram a day. Maybe then it's revisiting a cycle if that's what it requires to manage.
That's
Then there's
always what I
too
say. If
much
you're
test,
having to take that level
too
and for that
much.
type of dosage, you need to reevaluate the entire
Yeah.
cycle design at that point.
And total shutdown for a man, and not that man ever wants to totally shut down, but like clinically, a total shutdown for a man with Arimidex specifically is almost 10 milligrams a day. It's a huge dose. Like no one would ever use. That's for if a man had estrogen dependent cancer, that's the size of the dose that a man is given. It's massive. You'd be out of your mind to take that kind of dose. Women experience almost 100% shutdown of estrogen at 1 milligram a day. Men get some of between 83 and 88% shutdown. We just respond differently to different drugs. So if you take data, again, misinterpreting data, if you take data from women's breast cancer and try to apply that
Apply
to
it
a
to
man,
males.
it doesn't necessarily lead to the same thing.
I
But
think
I
that's
think
probably one of the most confusing data points when people are trying to find the information for themselves, is that because there really isn't, there's not a magic equation for it. And I'm glad to hear that you also, because realistically, I'm going to stick to pretty much a standard reference range and biofeedback, especially if we are keeping testosterone maybe under like 1,000 nanograms per deciliter if we're looking at total test. But once you start pushing into higher super physiological levels and you have a lot of compounds at play and you are utilizing a lot, you're going to see it go up. That's just part of it. But that threshold, and I know some people work off of percentages, their E2 to total test, but
it's not based on
I
anything.
feel like that can work to some degree until you really start seeing those numbers, especially for testosterone, much higher. And then
Yeah.
you're completely, you know, you're not acknowledging your biofeedback at that point when you're only assessing the number. So I do personally, I'll let E2 come up a little bit. And I usually try and keep it under like 70,
Yeah.
75,
And
depending on where we're at. But a lot of it's dependent on the individual. And if, we're looking at body composition and biofeedback, and again, erection regularity is also something that we're analyzing. But there's really not a set number I have found. And because the numbers change so much from individual to individual, even if you were giving them the exact same protocols,
different.
lab work reveals very, very different numbers. between
So
them.
many factors go into that, not just aromatization. But and that's where I came up with the 80 from, is noticed um, it seems to be where the IGF level starts to drop when you get the estrogen over 80. So there's clearly something else going on, like the binding protein 1 or something is occurring at that point. It's going to take more research, but you're on the right track to keep it like in the 70s or something on the very high end, right? If you have a guy, people aren't going to believe this, but like there are definitely guys who their total testosterone in the blood is 4,000 nanograms. I mean, I've seen it numerous times. I've had mine well into the thousands. So it's definitely a possibility if you use enough. You don't need your estrogen at 300 at that point. So that's
No.
what the ratio. Like, I'm not sure. Like you and I, we were just talking about that before. I mean, I saw someone's the other day who was in the mid 300s, which is higher than most women outside of pregnancy. Like you
It's
just
like
don't.
first trimester of pregnancy.
Yeah,
Like it's,
I think the highest I've ever seen was a 600 in a man. But there was
of
actually
how
something wrong,
much?
600, but there was something wrong. There was something wrong with them. Um, but yeah, I mean, those are numbers, but this is honestly, if this trend continues, that's kind of where this is going almost. Is it going to keep pushing this number up and up and up, thinking that you're somehow leveraging something?
So I
I
think
don't know.
the big discussion now is we know not to crush E2 now. That's, I think that is pretty widely known and accepted. When we start to see estrogen in very high ranges and chronically high estrogen for extended periods of time, what are some of the health impacts that you start to see? Not even just in terms of physique, but actual like physical health and dangers.
Well, I mean, you have the more immediate stuff, like it's going to cause vasopressin to go up, so it's going to cause water retention, which is going to put stress on your kidneys, and you can have a stroke. So you have, and right, that's to bodybuilders, the stroke is probably the most deadly thing
Highest
that
risk.
can happen, and the highest risk, right? Because it just and it occurs, and it's considered a silent killer, right? Because we don't notice it per se. Um, and so this is what a lot of guys are then managing with ARBs. Um, Again, I would look at the estrogen before I start adding other compounds there, just to manage blood pressure, especially if you're young and healthy. Why do you have a blood pressure issue? I think longer term, I would just be worried about cancer risks. Estrogen can be, I always hesitate with cancer. I think cancer is a really tough subject, and I don't have all the answers with that stuff. If I did, or anyone did, we would have a cure for these things. So I always hesitate to say things that are definitive when it comes to cancer. But estrogen is a carcinogen to an extent. If it's out of control, it can contribute to a lot of things like colon cancer and breast cancer, depending on genes and how it's cleared out of the body. Right. So I wouldn't let it, for long-term risks like cancer, I wouldn't let it run super high. We don't know yet. Especially males, our body was not designed to have an estrogen of 300. Just your body doesn't know what to do with that. Now, not to say that our body was designed to have an androgen load of 4,000 either, but testosterone in and of itself is not a carcinogen. So it is not going to cause that per se. It can cause other issues, but not that. Prostate cancer is another one that's it's very debated. I believe in the theory that it's mostly lack of vitamin D and higher estrogen that's causing prostate cancer. It's not so much an androgen load. DHT can cause the prostate to enlarge, but that's generally not cancerous. I just think in general, it's just there's a ton of stuff we just don't know, because now we're pushing our bodies into this place that just has not been seen, and
Mhm.
and like we talked about, it's not researched, so no one's going to see this stuff coming when it starts to pop up,
Now
because it's not going
there's a lot of data. This would be probably something you would know more about. There's a lot of data that talks about chronically elevated estrogen in men and risk for development for type 2 diabetes.
to. Okay.
And obviously, I think it was there were a couple studies that were looking at the adipokines, I think specifically, and how it impacted glucose metabolism in males. And so I don't know how much research has been. That's not something that I've looked into a lot. That might be something you might know a little bit more about. But there is a strong correlation between type 2 diabetes and chronically elevated estrogen as well.
Yep. Yeah, again, estrogen is required for glycogen storage, so it's something that is needed at a range. But then again, when you go above, it's causing disordered glucose metabolism. So yeah, so the estrogen itself is doing what you're saying, but it's also then generally those people tend to have more body fat too. So it's a magnifying the issue as well. And you tend to see, there tend to be these correlations, right? You tend to see in men who develop type 2 diabetes tend to have lower testosterone, higher estrogen, higher body fat. There's certain traits that just go hand in hand with these things.
And body composition too. So even not even looking at addition of adipose tissue, but just storage and how it sits on the body.
Yep.
I think that is overlooked a lot. And I feel like when you see levels that are that high, especially if it is someone that does tend to be higher body fat to begin with, you can see it.
Yep.
And I don't
So
think a
you
lot
have
of people
gynoid
realize
and
that.
android
You can,
fat
it is
stored
visual.
patterns. Yeah. So men would typically store fat around their waist and their love handles, right? And women tend to store it on their butt and their hips. And you do see that in men whose estrogen is elevated. Their legs tend to get heavier, their hips. They'll start to store it down there. Then it becomes more of their primary actually starts to actually shift, right? To more of like what a woman would deal with.
Mm-hmm.
Like when you see men, again, some of this stuff is not fully proven, but there's a lot of correlations. When you see men that just have lower testosterone per se, or just insulin resistance with some level of low testosterone, but not necessarily an estrogen issue, they tend to have the classic really thin arms, thin limbs, and the big, lots of visceral fat and the distended stomach. That's not necessarily like estrogen issues. Estrogen issues are when it starts to go down, like around their butt.
So one of the things that, I mean, that's the big question is erections.
Okay.
I have a lot of people that reach out to me that maybe they started TRT. Maybe they are blasting 1.5 grams of gear every week. Very different scenarios for these males, but it usually starts out as erection irregularity. That's what we see a lot of. And then, of course, they might tell their prescriber if they are on TRT, and the first thing they throw at them is Cialis. And they're not really pulling labs to check to see what, the potential underlying issues are there. And then, of course, when you start really pushing heavy quantities, estrogen management becomes an issue there as well. Now, I'm seeing a lot of men that will come to me and they say, hey, I'm taking an AI. I'm taking X amount. And of course, it's always a high amount. There's no way I have high estrogen. Like, why is my penis not working? Why?
Okay.
It's not working on demand. They're not waking up with morning erections. It's very irregular, and it's to the point where it's impacting their relationships.
Yep. So estrogen. Sorry.
Keep going.
No, I was going to say, so estrogen obviously plays a role there, right, in sexual health. I think what you said is interesting too. I think, again, doctors are mismanaging this. So you have, for erectile health, you really have psychological issues, right, which no one talks about ever. So there's clearly like, there could be something wrong up here that's not allowing you to be aroused. You have blood flow issues, which is what they seem to be addressing, but it's very rarely a blood flow issue. It's not about Cialis or Viagra. Generally, not to say that can't aid, but that's most likely not the issue. If that becomes an issue, you probably have other things going on with clogged arteries or some other health issue. So testosterone is the primary hormone responsible for males' genitals and the health of the genitals, the development of them. But that being said, estrogen is required for it to work right and for sperm production and semen production. And there's a range, just like everything else. Where it gets tricky is using an erection to determine if someone needs testosterone or TRT is not always the greatest thing. If your erection is gone or you have sexual problems because of low testosterone, it means your testosterone is way at the bottom of the range. So from a morphology point of view, where humans developed, it may rub some people wrong, but basically men, our role is to breed and probably find food and defend. So if we were not able to breed, we were relatively useless at that point, like in a Neanderthal or Paleolithic way. So if it's a testosterone issue, it's way at the bottom. That should be addressed. That should not be the mark. Men shouldn't wait until their erection doesn't work to go get on TRT. They should be looking at labs much sooner than that, assuming that's the issue. But your question is more specifically if the androgens are correct, they're already on TRT, or they're normal and they're healthy and they're young, or they're on a cycle, whether it's 500 milligrams or 5,000 milligrams, and their erection is not correct. It's generally an estrogen issue. And like you, I see it all the time. And more often than not, it's estrogen being elevated. You do occasionally see some guys that will crush their estrogen, like you said, with an AI or before a contest. So any man who's competed, most likely before a show, you've crushed your estrogen in order to get off the last little bit of fat and the last little bit of water. But at that point, you're probably not interested in much sex anyway.
If you are, you're
But
probably not ready to hit stage. So
yeah, exactly. So but on a normal, so I think from a man's point of view, erection should be predictable. I think you should have something in the morning. Now, that doesn't mean that 7 days a week it needs to be there, because like anything else natural, it's unpredictable, right? But it should be somewhat consistent. I think then, so you have, it's more the estrogen. So you have estrogen has an alpha and a beta receptor. It's more the beta receptor that affects men's genitals than the alpha receptor. So they've found when they knock out the alpha receptor in animals, it doesn't really affect the erection. It's more the beta receptor. We don't need to go into too much of why that is, because it's not so much relevant to your audience. But what basically, if estrogen, you want to know like the symptoms, like what a man would experience if it's high or low, like how
yes,
that works.
I would love that.
So when it's high, it would typically be premature ejaculation. So unless it's very, very high. So if it's higher than the range, but it's not out of this, it's not like incredibly elevated, generally premature ejaculation would occur. Erection can occur, but it's probably not as hard as it should be. If it's way elevated, then erection would not occur. So it'll swing the other direction, no pun intended. Now it's not going to work. If it's low and crushed, most likely the same kind of thing. So it's just not going to function. Probably lack of sensitivity. So like if there's delayed ejaculation, that's generally low estrogen. So most men can probably judge by what their performance is or what's actually occurring to kind of figure out, without even doing labs, where the estrogen fits in. And anyone who's let it go high or low can generally will have experienced that at some point. There's generally other mood things though. So most guys should notice their mood is changing as their estrogen is moving as well. I don't know if this is something that do these guys ever give you other side effects?
That's one of the things that I've actually had men that were able to, and of course they've had prior experience running these cycles, but they can tell me, they say, hey, this is what my biofeedback is, this is what I'm experiencing, I'm catching myself being more emotional, I'm feeling the impact of estrogen. We pull labs and we make corrective action based on what those labs reveal. But I think that's really hard for a lot of males, especially if you are new and you haven't been through this. And like for you, you've been through a contest prep, you know your body inside and out, when the highs are high, when the lows are low, without a doubt. But the average person is not going to be able to identify that. And so, especially as, whether you're a physician, whether you're a coach, or even just a significant other, relying on someone for adequate biofeedback, especially when we're talking hormonal markers, can be very difficult because most people are not going to be able to identify that. And like I've had clients where I've asked about their erection regularity or even history, because some men, they'll experience erections during a specific sleep cycle and it might not occur in the morning, but that might be regular for them. A lot of men I have noticed don't actually notice a pattern. They've never paid attention to it. It's just been something that they have lived with. So they've never tried to identify that. They've never had a reason to analyze, do I have an erection this morning? How's the quality? So that's been an issue to try and get that feedback as well.
I guess it can make sense if it's something that just seems to always work as you perceive normal. Why would you pay attention to it, right? Until it doesn't work, and then you're not sure what really is going on. I think at that point, outside of getting labs, I think outside of that point, then I would use ability to achieve an erection, how, and then what happens ejaculatory wise, where estrogen is, right? So estrogen is required to make semen too. So if semen volume is low, estrogen a lot of times is low as well. That's actually required to put the easiest way to explain, basically the fluid that's going into the semen is basically is a product of estrogen. What was I going to say? Oh, so one of the more common ones too, you probably get as well, is people want to blame prolactin for this erectile.
That's where I was going next, was prolactin.
So prolactin's a funny thing. So basically, prolactin in men. So prolactin in men is not 100% understood. In women, it's a lactation hormone, and it's fairly well understood. In men, I'll back up for a second. So when you said before that a lot of people or doctors don't understand the hormonal stuff when it comes to erectile function or any of this stuff, so people can understand in medical school, endocrinology is not looked at as a major that's particularly important. It's grouped with pediatrics and at this point psychiatry. So it's kind of pushed off. So when you're in your third year and you start to look at specializing in things, it's really not an offering. So it makes sense that most doctors don't want to look at labs that have hormones on them, don't want to talk about this stuff because they've never learned anything about it. But they were taught that testosterone is terrifying, right? It's needed for puberty, and then it basically is this horrible thing that could be terrifying and dangerous. And God forbid you inject it. And they learn a little more about women's health because it involves pregnancy. If you become an OBGYN, you have to understand, obviously, women's health, but they don't really talk about men's endocrinology ever, outside of now diabetes, maybe some thyroid stuff, but most doctors are not educated in this realm. So I think that kind of adds to the problem as well, right? If the medical community doesn't understand this stuff, how is the general population going to understand this stuff? So with prolactin in men, it really the only two times, unless you have an adenoma, which is a non-cancerous tumor on your pituitary gland, the only two times it's really elevated is if estrogen goes up or if thyroid hormone goes down. If those two things are not changed, prolactin generally is not present in some strange amount. But it's, even that being the case, it's not necessarily the driver of the erectile issue. I know guys want to blame that because they've read on forums, Nandrolone or DECA, that's what's causing it. And that's generally not the issue. I don't know, outside of adenomas, I can't honestly tell you I've ever even seen elevated prolactin in a man on labs, ever.
I think aside from like dopamine influence,
Yeah.
And that's usually compound driven. So
Totally. But you never see,
outside of
it's
that,
not
that's
like,
the only time I've really seen
you
it
don't
be
generally see
changed.
guys with elevated prolactin. So in theory, testosterone would raise prolactin as well through aromatization. So, and you don't see testosterone itself causing erectile issues. So it's not a prolactin issue generally. And guys want to take things like cabergoline, which has its own set of issues. It's not a drug that I would recommend outside of Parkinson's disease, which it was designed for. It's not generally considered safe. I know bodybuilders will use this stuff. It will cause it'll improve sexual function regardless of prolactin is the issue as well, too. So using that as a metric to determine if prolactin was the issue isn't valid because on its own it works, whether prolactin is elevated or not. So it's not like proof that there was an issue, right? And prolactin is provable because you can just get labs and have your prolactin measured.
It always goes back to labs. That is always like the reoccurring theme.
Kind of the answer always. I think where people probably struggle though, and you and I can help them with this, is a lot of doctors won't write labs that they don't understand because they don't. So they won't write for prolactin because they don't know how to read it. So you and I talked about this offline a couple of weeks ago, is when a doctor writes for specific labs, they're responsible if there's an issue. So if a doctor writes for a bunch of metrics that they don't know how to interpret or they don't know how to fix without referring you out, they don't want to know, they don't want to see it because then there's an issue for them. And the other issue is that typically doctors are taught that they are the expert and that they know the answers, and they're never really admitting that they're wrong or they don't know something. I don't agree with any of this behavior. This is just kind of what's taught.
It can put them in an uncomfortable position. And that's what I try and explain to my clients. Like if I'm trying to get my client to pull labs through their physician so they can utilize insurance, I'll create like a PDF document. I think I told you that, where it explains their biofeedback, like why it's valid, why they're wanting the labs. But it does, because they don't want to be viewed as inferior in any capacity. And it puts them in an uncomfortable situation to pull markers that they might not be able to interpret the data correctly, or even worse, if it comes back skewed, and it would be on them to technically treat that. And it's not something they're comfortable treating. You don't want to go to a patient and say, I don't understand this, because again, it puts you in an uncomfortable position.
Yeah. And you're not supposed to. I mean, you can ask Todd about this. I know this is something that I'm taught, is that I'm supposed to act like I'm an expert and I know the answers, and I never don't know the answer. No, I don't agree with that. And I'll be the first to tell you, and you and I talk about this all the time, is I definitely don't know the answer to everything. I know I have a small window of things that I'm good at, and the rest of it, I could probably look it up, but it doesn't mean I know it or how to fix it. So, but that's not how doctors are taught nowadays. So this is kind of where the problem is you go to these doctors and they're going to give you resistance about stuff they don't understand.
Even referrals are difficult. I've had a lot of pushback on referrals where labs come back and in their eyes, because they really are sticking to reference ranges for the most part, they are out of range. But even
Yep.
getting a referral to a specialist we get a lot of pushback.
Yeah, no. And but again, I think that you and I and various other coaches that we're friends with can aid in this stuff, right? I know I advocate for patient health. I will gladly write a doctor an email or get on the phone with someone um, if they need someone in their corner to help them explain why we're looking for something, or we can find someone else to write labs. Right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a million other places you can go. Right? There's online clinics that we can get labs done through. There are other doctors that will understand these things. So I think that that's kind of where the importance of finding a coach that understands these things, like yourself, that's where the value is, right? Is your knowledge and your understanding of these things versus just someone who just a coach that just pushes drugs or pushes diets or pushes stuff and they don't understand anything else about the way the body's working.
And now you did a post, what was this? Two days ago, you did a post on I think it was erectile issues
With Deck.
from,
Yeah.
yes.
Yep. And that's kind of what I was saying is it's multifaceted. I don't Nandrolone if you were to run Nandrolone solo so Nandrolone doesn't really aromatize to estrogen at 1% or well, let's say 20% of testosterone. So it's very low. Testosterone aromatizes at 5%. So
It does, but
20% of
it's
high.
only a
So
small
it's
fraction
1%.
of what
It's
testosterone
like literally
does.
1%. It's not enough to support your health. So Nandrolone on its own will most likely just cause no sex drive at all. And not something, and then for the lack of estrogen, not something that I would recommend. I know that there are coaches and people online that preach Nandrolone only cycles. Not really my cup of tea. I'm not really sure what the point is. If you're hair sensitive, if your biggest concern is your hair falling out, one, I would say steroids are probably not the ideal road to go down. And two, honestly, using testosterone alone with something to block DHT would probably be a safer, healthier way to do that, topically, not orally. In my mind, than just trying to run Nandrolone only and destroying other things to save your hair. I don't know of a whole lot of women that would rather a man with a full head of hair and no working and a non-functioning penis versus, you know, so Nandrolone. So you have a couple issues, right? It doesn't 5-alpha reduce the DHT. It 5-alpha reduces something called dihydronandrolone, which can block DHT to an extent. It doesn't have the same affinity. So if there's any DHT present, the DHT will basically displace the DHN. So that's generally not what's causing it. It's just the progesterone nature of Nandrolone makes the estrogen receptors more sensitive. So you're skewing the way estrogen's working. And if you add too much testosterone in there and that's not managed, again, then the estrogen goes too high and it actually becomes an estrogen issue. And guys don't want to hear that. They want to believe it's prolactin or it's
And that's what
DHN.
you had written about, is at the end of the day,
It's
it
estrogen.
ends up boiling down
Get
to
labs.
estrogen.
Yeah, and get labs because that's the thing is, you and I could talk about this stuff, you know, until the cows come home. But if people aren't getting labs and actually looking at what's going on in their bodies, they can believe whatever they like. But over time and time and time again, you and I see the same thing. It's generally it's estrogen. It's skewed, right? It's never in the right place, and that's generally the answer. Is if you can stabilize it by some means in a normal, healthy way, then generally most of those issues go away. It's not just that you can't use Nandrolone. Nandrolone in and of itself is not a horrible drug. I also don't think Nandrolone itself does anything anabolically that testosterone doesn't. I don't think there's magic there. It's like anything else. But I also don't think it needs a bad name because it's not the Nandrolone itself that's causing the issue. It's the lack of the estrogen management again.
Now, when you see, I think one of the reasons why we see so much DECA as well is because it is a prescribable compound. And so we have people that are seeking out basic TRT treatment. They push their test a little bit higher, and then they're offered DECA essentially. So we see that a lot. And that's outside of a bodybuilding context entirely. And I think there is going to be a 200 milligram per week cap on that. I think we're going to see a cap on that in the context of people that are getting it prescribed. What do you see in terms of prevalence with ED and those using DHT blockers?
A DHT blocker and Nandrolone together?
Either with, maybe it might be nandrolone with testosterone, or just with testosterone, or basically any compounds where they're also implementing the DHT blockers.
Okay. Well, if you run a DHT blocker per se with nandrolone, it will actually, so nandrolone, this is another thing that people don't understand. Nandrolone itself as a base hormone is more androgenic than DHN. It's just that it readily 5-alpha reduces to DHN. So you generally don't get, we have a lot of that enzyme in our scalp. So you generally don't deal with nandrolone directly on your scalp, but nandrolone itself will make your hair fall out. If you block the 5-alpha reductase part of nandrolone and it stays nandrolone, it will still interact with your hair and make your hair fall out. So no androgenous hair safe. There are various compounds that are worse than others.
But nobody wants to hear that, because they want what's risk-free. They don't want to know that there's always going to be a
Nothing
risk with
safe.
the
Anavar can
compound.
make your hair fall out. Winstrol can make your hair fall out. Masteron can make your hair fall out. It's a lot of it's individual. It's genetic. If you're predisposed to hair loss, your hair's going to fall regardless. If you're not predisposed to hair loss, it might not fall out, or it might fall out when you get to the gram quantity gear, right? I mean, mine has come and gone several times. It depends what I do, what I'm prepping for. When I prep for a show, a lot of times it just comes out. When I crash my estrogen, my hair falls out. And I'm not necessarily prone to hair loss, but it just depends over time. If you use enough androgens and you use them for long enough and high enough doses, your hair's going to come out. So it's not, like I said before, if that's someone's biggest concern, bodybuilding is probably not the road to go down. I'd say this.
Even if you're careful with like what substrates you're using in terms of like 5-AR, it's, if you're pushing the dosages, it's one of those inevitables.
It's going to happen. Yeah. And there's certain things that are worse than others. You know, I hate to say it because there's people online that would disagree with this, but trenbolone is very androgenic and it'll make your hair fall out. And it happens fast generally. Part of it could be because it's crushing estrogen. Part of it because it's androgenic in its own right. And on a milligram basis, it's stronger than everything else. So you're getting, 100 milligrams of that is more like 300 milligrams of testosterone. Or on some scales, depending on how you're measuring, it could be the equivalent of 500 milligrams of testosterone. So if you multiplied your dose of TRT 3 or 5-fold, your hair is probably going to fall there too. But I don't think, going back to nandrolone, I'm confused. I understand why doctors prescribe it or why people want it because of the perceived joint health from it. I don't necessarily think it's like a first call drug. And I don't think it's something that the average guy, especially outside of the bodybuilding world, should probably really mess with.
That's how I feel about it. And again, in a bodybuilding application, I can definitely see the perks. But when you talk about the joint benefits, it doesn't make sense. Even when you say it out loud, my joints hurt. I would like to take anabolic steroids to fix that. That just doesn't, saying that out loud is not going to be the first course of action.
I think, and we could do whole videos on that. I think there's a ton of other healthier ways to go about it versus steroids. We won't even need to get into the joint stuff. I find it odd to prescribe nandrolone for that. I see a lot of people, regular lifestyle guys, that get written for very small amounts of nandrolone, 50 milligrams in some cases, up to 200, like you said, and they have mental issues from it. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's the first, like I've said 3 times now, I don't think it's a first call drug. I don't think it's a first call drug when it comes to bodybuilding either. I think that there's a ton of other things that'll do the job just as well without introducing things that can cause potential harm. I mean, nandrolone, on one hand, it's been around for 70 years or almost 80 years at this point. It's considered safe, but safe in the realm of when it's used for terminally ill people that are already dying. I think in the realm of people that are being healthy, it has a ton of risks. It's not necessarily the healthiest thing to be running. And I don't know if doctors that don't have a background in this stuff really should be prescribing that drug to the average guy over joint health versus addressing maybe what their diet is. What else what other supplements? Are they taking things like fish oil? What else do they do? What is their lifestyle doing before you go right nandrolone? I
think so much of it now falls back on some of the prescribers and how they pitch the compounds. I had a client come to me, and I think I one of my first videos with Todd, we had discussed why so many women think Anavar is a GLP-1 agonist. They just assume that they're just going to drop body fat, they're not going to be hungry, their life is going to be made better by taking Anavar. And I don't know where that misconception started, but especially me being on the TikTok realm, I see a lot of that. I see those short form videos pushing a product essentially. But I had a male client come to me and he said, well, I have Anavar. And I was like, okay, why? Where? Like, would you just keep it in your closet for fun or rainy day? And he said, well, no, I told my TRT clinic that I was wanting to lose weight.
Mhm.
And so when they gave me my testosterone refill, they also gave me Anavar.
About 20 milligrams. I think that's generally
So
like
the way 25 milligrams Anavar,
not
and
anymore
that's,
though. Now it's against the law, but
is it really?
it was just Rick Collins posted something in August. I believe it's considered it's illegal now for TRT
I know
clinics.
there was a thing with
Doesn't mean they
Gemini
won't do it.
Laboratories specifically, but I'm still seeing
We
it
can look.
prescribed as of
Are
now, but
you
it might
okay?
just be
I
certain
could be wrong.
pharmacies.
I could be wrong. I have to go look at that.
I know it definitely progressed. At first, it almost seemed like it was just affecting those that were using it for like post surgery recovery to
which
help
is
prevent
which is a
atrophy and
shame.
stuff. Is two and a
'Cause it,
half and five were
yeah,
like taken off the market first, I think.
yeah. That's a shame because the FDA actually just there was a study that was just done right before that ruling came out where the FDA changed the dosing guideline for children that were burn victims, and they were having children run it for 2 years continuously because it was actually aiding. The drug has a ton of value in burn victims,
Hmm.
especially children.
That's what most of the studies are. If you look them
Yeah,
up,
and
almost all of them
it's
are
really a shame because it is a
studies.
really valuable drug when it comes to those things. And off the top of my head, I don't know of a single death that's ever occurred directly from Anavar, which you can't really say that about most drugs. Because even Primobolan, I know of one death that came from Primobolan acetate. Again, that was a fluke, but Anavar, as far as I know, there's no data to show anyone's ever died from it. So why you would outlaw a drug that really is overall relatively safe versus, look, Tylenol kills people every day,
Yeah.
literally. Um, I think Anavar is another weird one. I'm not really sure why a TRT clinic would prescribe it for that use. I think it still is liver toxic, right? It's kidney toxic. I don't think 20 milligrams is really that effective for a man in that
I mean, when we see it in
outside of
bodybuilding,
burn.
we start at 50 is typically
Yeah.
where you're going to
And,
see that.
and for HIV. So again, when someone suffers burns, really bad burns, that's, 70% of their body, 80% of their body, their metabolism speeds up really quickly in order to heal themselves. And what happens is, just like taking thyroid medicine, you waste muscle. So you use a drug like Anavar and it prevents the nitrogen loss. So their metabolism is very different from mine or yours in, like you said, so bodybuilders men typically start at 50 milligrams. In HIV patients, one of the reasons why they stopped using Anavar is the dose to effectively stop weight loss was like 80 milligrams a day. So it just was not an efficient thing to use anymore. That's why they switched to other things. But for a TRT clinic to write 20 milligrams, I'm not sure. And the weight loss thing always throws me for a loop, right? Women, talk to a lot of women about using, I have talked to a lot of women that want to use Anavar for weight loss. And what people misunderstand is anabolic steroids build up tissue. They're not necessarily causing fat loss per se, right? There is an androgen receptor on your fat cells, and you, in theory, will lose some body fat when your androgenic hormones are elevated. That being said, Anavar is not written for weight loss in hospitals. It's actually written for the opposite reason. So then women take Anavar and the scale goes up and then they freak out.
Yep.
I was going to lose weight. Yeah, but you're taking a steroid that's supposed to build mass. It's not designed to cause weight
And
loss.
I've always wondered where that misconception came from. But I think after hearing that, I feel like some of it is marketing
Yeah,
from the
because it's a
prescribers.
fat loss. It burns fat. The study, and there's probably one study that I can think of where it showed it caused fat loss. It was in basically out of shape, middle-aged, severely overweight men. It caused more belly fat loss on a milligram basis than testosterone or nandrolone. That being said, in that same study, when they elevated the testosterone and the nandrolone, both of them caused greater fat loss than the Anavar. It was only Anavar is similar to Trembolone in that on a milligram basis, it's actually very potent. But when you bring the dose up to equal something else, it's not anymore. And no one would run, at least no one with full sanity would run, you're not going to run 700 or 800 milligrams of Anavar if you want to keep your kidneys and your liver long term. So it's not like an efficacious thing to use. And I don't know why TRT clinics would write it at 20 milligrams, what they're accomplishing when you're already using testosterone on top of it. Right?
And there
When I
was
do the
there was
same,
one study that I didn't even really look into it. There's some loose evidence showing that it may increase T4 to T3
Yeah,
conversion.
it blocks
And I think that
the basically, yeah.
now it's a miracle fat loss drug
Yeah, there
from
was
that.
one study to show that. Yeah, it was not, but it's relatively irrelevant in the whole scheme of things, right? Like I think there's so many factors when people talk about fat loss, and you and I know this from a coaching point of view. Talk about fat loss, there's so many things that go into it, and probably the biggest thing is diet. Like if someone's diet is off, it doesn't matter what they take, they will not lose weight, right? There's no magic way to outdo
And that's what
that
it comes to, and
within
that's where
reason.
we're seeing the prescriptions for DECA, and where we see DECA and Anavar being pretty loosely prescribed. A lot of those factors are what they're being prescribed for. Again, dietary changes are really what's going to make the biggest impact for the
But
things that
people don't
they're
want to do that.
being prescribed for.
Yeah, people
But
don't
again,
want
it's
to
not a
listen.
coaching service at that point. It
Yeah,
is, that
but
they're in the business of selling you those
yeah,
compounds.
that's what they're doing, right? Because that's what people would rather inject something. Like that's well, I mean, what was the which the weight loss was it Weight Watchers? One of the big ones, like Weight Watchers, just went out of business.
Did
Could be
they?
Weight Watchers. One of the bigger ones that had a point system or whatever. I think literally just filed for bankruptcy because of Ozempic. Because their whole model doesn't make any sense, right? Because if you say to people, well, you have to measure your food, you have to eat this or that, an apple is this and a cake is this, and you still need to pay attention to what you eat. And then all of a sudden the FDA comes along like, well, or you could just inject this and not be hungry. Where do you think the money's going to go? It's the same place with Nandrolone. That's it. It's like billions of dollars in business a year. And all of those drugs fit in the same category, whether people want to believe it or not. Trenbolone fits in the same category as Ozempic. It's for cosmetic enhancement. That's why it's used. It's not. There's no one in America that needs Trenbolone for a medical reason per se. It's that these things all fit because people would rather focus on that stuff than they would on fixing their food. But you and I know as coaches that the drugs are. It's like genetics is the top. Like when you and I talked about
Mm-hmm.
this a lot. Like genetics is the top thing that's going to dictate outcome. And then probably farther down, you have food is probably here, right? Training is probably below food. I'd say food is more important than training per se. As long as you're doing something difficult, it's probably going to work. Things in magic training split. And then gear is probably in the bottom. Like it's like an overdrive. It just allows you to recover a little
But
better
even gear,
and grow a
I
little.
that still falls almost directly under genetics, because somebody may or
Yeah.
may not have certain genetic predispositions. You look at someone like me, I can't even take a milligram of testosterone once a week, and of course I'm actually testosterone deficient. So I
But if
feel
you're
like
alive.
that again, that falls under genetics being that top
Yeah.
tier.
Oh, I was just gonna say, and then you have the
I was
opposite. You
scooting, I
guys, your
cut out.
bodybuilders in
Sorry.
the '90s, like you have guys like like a Flex Wheeler that didn't necessarily need that much. He was a freak, right? So like that's all genetics. Like there's no magic cycle or diet that's gonna get you like Flex Wheeler.
Hmm.
So that's kind of the opposite. That's what I was saying. Is the genetic thing is gonna
Now,
dictate
in terms
everything.
of injections for estrogen,
Okay.
do a lot of the clinics will not actually. I don't think any of them really talk about subcutaneous injections for testosterone. We obviously, I typically recommend more frequent injections. I like
Mhm.
subcutaneous injections, especially if you have a predisposition to aromatize, which I think there can be some misconceptions about that, because we were talking about like aromatase enzyme activity in adipose tissue. So injecting something directly into adipose tissue might not seem like the best equation in terms of estrogen management, but because you are less likely to get those spikes, um, that you would see with
Mhm.
intramuscular, I personally like. Of course, not everybody, especially bodybuilders, are going to be able to
Yeah.
inject. Volume becomes an issue at higher dosages, so not everybody's a candidate for that. I have not actually had a situation where we have tried to change injection schedule or method for the purpose of estrogen management. Have you
Okay.
done that
I have. Yeah.
successfully?
So again, I think the difference is for TRT or guys using small doses, it works. I think sub Q is a valid option for guys on smaller amounts. I think once you're at a C, like 1 ml, every injection, it's no longer, to me, it's not a valid option. You're going to blow your skin out
Yeah,
and it
you
hurts.
can't.
So I don't use sub Q. My testosterone needs are higher than what sub Q would allow.
Mhm.
I'll get to that in a second because that's a different strategy. I have because generally, so what you're talking about is the more frequent that you inject and the smaller, like if you microdose or smaller amounts every single day, you'll get less waves, peaks and valleys, and you'll get less aromatization and less DHT. When you get a big bolus, the body doesn't know what to do with this big amount, right? The normal male is looking at like 10 milligrams, give or take, of testosterone a day production. When you inject 200 milligrams, the body doesn't know what to do with it. So it's going to take excess and immediately aromatize it to estrogen and immediately 5-alpha reduce the DHT to kind of buffer what's occurring in the blood. So the more frequent smaller injections is going to manage those side effects. It should bring DHT down as well. I think where people mistake aromatize is found in fat, like we talked about, but guys are like, well, then why would you inject it directly in your fat? Well, where they're wrong, and I've heard people make this mistake with growth hormone as well, where you inject it per se is not going to dictate the outcome, because the outcome as far as that immediate tissue, because it still has an ester on it that has to be cleaved before it enters circulation. Testosterone is not a spot injection thing that's changing at the site. It has to enter circulation first before it's actually working. So it doesn't matter. The fat, like you said, is just slowing down the breakdown. It's not affecting, it's not like it cleaves off and immediately interacts with aromatase because it's sitting right there. It's going to enter circulation first, and there's less blood, there's less capillaries in body fat. So it's going to take longer for it to get into circulation.
So when
So
you
you're,
have shifted people from IM
yeah,
to
yep,
sub-Q, which I have not for this purpose anyways, does it actually
it does.
drastically change the
Yep,
values to
it
where
did.
maybe you could eliminate an AI?
Drastic, no, but enough that it made a difference that they didn't need an AI, assuming the
Okay.
dose was small. So like then you have, so someone, I'm a lower aromatizer. I can tolerate I mean, it depends on how long you've been doing this in your muscle mass and your metabolism things. I can tolerate like probably a gram, 1,200 milligrams without an AI generally, testosterone at this point. I think initially it was lower, 500 or 600. So it was always on the higher end. I don't do well with not only the volume issue, I don't do well with frequent small, because I actually get less of an effect out of it, where I do like every other day or every third day, a bigger bolus. My body feels better with a bigger spike in things because I have lower estrogen production
Mhm.
and perhaps lower DHT production. It's hard to tell.
So that's a
So it's not,
twofold situation for you because of
yeah,
volume
so it's not
and
always
your
the right,
predispositions.
yeah, it's not always the right situation to do it daily, but for most guys that you and I are going to encounter, it's worth a try. I would go there before I would, on a small dose of these, using 150 milligrams a week. Why not, and try to inject more frequently instead of using an AI?
There's also ability or inability to adhere to an
Yeah.
administration
Well, this is why
schedule like
doctors
that
don't
too.
do it.
Some people just won't inject daily. That's just not something that's
Well, that's
realistic for all people.
correct. And this is where the ester thing came from, right? The first testosterone on the market in the 30s was suspension. And then you had testosterone propionate. And the problems were patient compliance. Most men outside of the bodybuilding world won't inject frequently. They're very needle adverse, and they're not going to inject frequently. So with sub-Q, at least you're using an insulin needle. It shouldn't hurt. It's not a big deal.
Shouldn't.
Shouldn't, in theory. Doesn't mean it's not going to. You get used to these things. The other thing is, if you're going to use IM, the site also matters, right? Like glutes have a better absorption. There's better blood flow there than the shoulder, per se, and that's been shown in studies. So I think there's ways to manage different things depending on what the outcome is that you're looking for. And even different esters, right? Like, I don't know, we could also do another whole video on this too. Like propionate has less HPTA shutdown because of its
Mhm.
kinetics versus a nantha or cypionate, even if the dose ester subtracted, even if the weight of the testosterone is the same. So there's ways, depending on the person's body and how they feel and how they react to things, you can manipulate these variables. But again, doctors aren't going to do this because they don't have all these things at their option, right? Most pharmacies do cypionate in the United States or nanthate overseas, and they don't have anything at their
That's
disposal.
it.
And they're not taught these things. Pharmacists don't learn this stuff. This is the stuff that, I spend hours researching. You spend hours
And again,
researching.
it's industry specific because for the average hypergonadal male that's just trying to feel human
Yep.
again, these really don't necessarily have this information doesn't have practical
Yeah.
application is important to know, especially for someone like you or in a position where you are coaching enhanced athletes. Absolutely. The average person, not a whole lot of crossover when we start really getting into the specifics if they're just simply taking TRT to function.
Yep. Totally. Yeah. And like you said, it doesn't really matter for them. Most likely not. But if there's an issue, I think with estrogen and with DHT, it's worth at least looking at before you add more drugs. I would always use, and I'm not flipping my opinion based on what I said earlier. I'm just proposing going with the more moderate view. I think I would always go least effective, the lowest effective dose on things and the least amount of drugs versus adding a bunch of things in, similar to what Derek was initially trying to convey. I think rather than, if you're on TRT, rather than adding an AI, maybe just change the dosing frequency if you're not against it, to see if you can manage these things in a more natural way. And same with blood pressure medicine. I don't understand when 25-year-old men are on blood pressure medicine because they're not managing their testosterone correctly. That seems dumb to me. And the fact that doctors don't even think twice about this, right? Those drugs were never designed for 20-year-old.
I always tell people in terms of, making the decision with an AI, if it's not broke, don't fix it.
Yeah.
If your estrogen's fine, you're happy with your test levels and everything, why would you start messing with things at that point? Now, again, this is not applicable to bodybuilding when we are going to be bringing in more compounds strategically, but if it's not broke, don't fix it. And that's a hard concept for a lot of people. And I think especially when things are readily available at their fingertips, and then they go online and they find a lot of videos with different, opinions speaking on this, and they're throwing words in them that maybe they're not familiar with. So it sounds really important and reliable. They're going to follow it blindly.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I get these all the time. I'm sure you get them, DMs or consulting calls where people ask, they've just seen all this information and they just don't know what to make of it. Right. And it's almost like, keep it simple. They're trying to complicate all these things and they're using these minimal amounts. You just don't need all that stuff. I think that at an advanced point, it's a whole different game, right? When you're talking about grams.
Yep.
Like I'm sure, like the video that Chase Irons made with Roman Fritz the other day, that's a different thing because you're talking about 5 grams of gear. But that's not a situation the average person will ever see or can even understand what that thought process is. So that's not a situation that most people outside of you and I even come in contact with.
So I think we definitely have some topics for next time as well. But I think a huge takeaway from this is you do need healthy amounts of estrogen. It has so many important purposes within your body. But I think really, if you're experiencing erectile dysfunction, the first thing you should do is draw labs and not message a strange woman on Instagram.
Yes.
Get your labs pulled instead of asking strangers.
And if you have those labs, I don't see it inappropriate then to ask someone
And we both offer consultation calls.
I would gladly send them to you, totally. But I feel like that's what I end up doing too, is when people ask me these questions, I said, do you have labs? When they want to get on the phone, that's what I need to see. I can't just guess, especially if they're in another country. I have no idea.
Yeah, doing a full assessment, and that's something that you and I both offer, is basically a full clinical analysis of blood work where we deep dive into things, and we are doing additional calculations, talking to you about your biofeedback, and we do take those extra steps when you do provide labs.
Yep. Exactly. Yeah.
And again, I'm going to do you have a link tree that we put down below?
Sure. Yeah, I will send it to you. Yep. Yeah, I have my Instagram. It's Kurt.Havens. My YouTube is Kurt.Havens.
Kurt has a functioning YouTube, like a real one. So
yours will be very soon as well.
And you just wrote a book on growth hormone as well. Yep. We'll put that down below, available for purchase.
Yep. And I'm writing one on anabolics as well too. So
do you have an ETA for that one?
Honestly, the rough part of it's pretty much done. Dr. Todd is going to draw some graphs for me. I was letting people in our circle
hand draw them.
No, I'm not going to hand draw them. Christmas, January, should be soon.
Okay, awesome.
It's huge. It's 500 plus pages at this point.
Okay, we'll put those links down below. Yeah. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
All right, thank you.
Take care.